Fasting was one of the hottest health topics from about 2019 through 2023, but the excitement around it has started to dwindle for a variety of different reasons, including health complications of excess extended fasting, especially when levels of baseline stress are already pretty high. What if there was a way to get most of the benefits without the same level of biological stress and without the hunger and cravings and some of the other downsides of typical fasts? Perhaps even a way that lets you maintain your social calendar and still go out and enjoy meals with friends, with family, and a whole lot more. Well, this exists, and there's a form of alternate fasting called the Fasting Mimicking Diet. Now, our guest this week will explain exactly what that is, but suffice to say, it's consuming certain foods in the right quantities to allow many of the same physiological processes that occur inside the body during fasts to continue while eating. This podcast is a crash course on the fasting mimetic diet, how to do it for beginners, the best and worst foods to include, how much to eat, when to eat, the pros and cons of this versus strict fasting, and then some helpful tools, products, and supplements to make the whole process easier and or more effective. Personally, whenever I fast, I like to do what's called the amplified fast and go into it having made a few small tweaks beforehand so that I get the best possible outcomes and it is the most pleasant. If you want to know how I do that, I will put a link to a short article I wrote on amplified fasting in the show notes for this episode. You can also find the show notes at mindbodypeak.com/164. Our guest this week is Inge Lindseth. He's a registered dietitian who sees the diet-related aspects of health from two primary angles: aging and the microbiome. He's published a book on the fasting mimicking diet and has contributed to several research papers available on PubMed and more. He works as a clinician in Oslo, Norway, and is currently writing a book on the slowing of aging. Now, I've personally never done the fasting mimicking diet, which we refer to in this episode often as FMD. My experience with fasting has mainly been intermittent fasting most days, and then a weekly 24-hour fast, and then a quarterly 3 to 5 day water fast. Although in the last couple of years, I've really cut down the frequency that I fast in any regard. These days, I intermittent fast about 3 days per week, sometimes four. I do a monthly 24-hour fast, and then once or twice per year, I'll do a longer 3 to 5 day fast. So later this year, I'm going to replace the 3 to 5 day fast with one course of the 5 day FMD. If you've tried it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments of how exactly it went for you, and if you have any tips or tricks to make it easier and more effective. All right, ladies and gentlemen, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Inge. Inge, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Today, we're going to be exploring a topic that I have not brought up at all on the podcast so far, and that is fasting mimicking diet. And we're going to talk about biomimicry, like the ways you can get more out of your fasts, as well as the immune system's role in overall health and a whole lot more.
Excellent. Yeah. So are you familiar with fasting, or your listeners familiar with fasting, but not fasting mimicking? Is that it, or?
Yeah, we'll go over that in a little bit, but first we'll start off with a warm-up, and that is the unusual non-negotiables you've done so far today for your health, your performance, and your bioharmony.
Since the last year, I have every day I've taken a bunch of supplements to slow aging, to try to slow aging. So I guess that's a non-negotiable. But I also like to be, spontaneous and not be too rigid in what I do. So, and I also think that, exactly the surprising things, and that you're kind of surprising your body, and it doesn't really know exactly what's going to come. I think that's also can be a good thing, to constantly, or at least once in a while, challenge your body.
How do you draw the line between adding enough variation where it's healthy versus, for example, if you have a vastly different time that you eat your meals every day, that can be detrimental because your like different biological processes, your circadian rhythm is tuned based on your lifestyle. And so if you're constantly varying it, kind of like your sleep wake times. If you're going to bed at one time and then you switch it and do totally different every day, that also can be detrimental. So how do you balance the two of like enough variation where it's healthy, but not too much where it's keeping your body guessing in a bad way?
That's a very pertinent question for me, because I'm writing about this in my upcoming book. So it's really good that I get to maybe get some counter arguments from you. But so I think, yeah, you have to, or it's good to differentiate between things that, the diurnal rhythm, let's say that you constantly go back and forth with when you go to bed. I don't think that's a good idea. It's not those kind of challenges that I think are good. And also eating really late, sure, the body can handle it okay, but that's like, I wouldn't do that too often either. I don't think that that's a challenge that really brings anything. It's you could say that it's almost always a negative.
I find that the whole variable of timing is vastly overlooked when it comes to lifestyle and diet specifically. It's like, okay, well, yeah, this is great, but then what about when you consume it? For example, if you have the same meal during the morning versus late at night, I forget the exact number, but it's like a 30% higher blood sugar response from the same meal.
And also that brings us, or I hope we can go into that right now. That when you look at studies on time restricted eating, I find that it's all lumped together. These studies that are done time restricted eating, and so you find some studies that don't really show that much, and you find other studies that show a lot. And when you look at those studies, or that's my impression, I haven't done a systematic review or anything on it yet, but they call this time restricted eating, but you were allowed to eat as late as 8 in the evening. And I think that maybe the most important thing about time restricted eating and why it has good benefits is that you don't eat that late. So you're not disrupting your circadian rhythm that much. You're not eating, so to say, while you're asleep. You are done with digestion before you go to bed. So I think that could be one reason for the discrepancies between studies.
What do you think is the good cutoff place? Is it around 2 hours, 3 hours before bed? And of course, there'll be some individual variability there, but in general, do you see any patterns emerge?
Not really. There aren't any hard data on that as far as I can see. Just my way of thinking is that you should have digested at least your food should be mostly out of your small intestine before you go to bed. So that would mean if you have a pretty large meal, that would mean like 3, 4 hours before you go to bed.
And how does that change when the seasons change? Because, for example, it might get dark at 4:30 p.m., 5 p.m. in the winter. And during the summer, it might get dark at 9-ish p.m. as it does over here. Do you vary that window at all based on like your meal timings, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner based on the light?
Well, I do think that it could have some effect, but also bear in mind that we as humans, our evolution was mostly on the plains of Africa, and there you had 11 to 12 hours of dark every day. So I believe that has shaped how we interact with nature the most, and not like these, last thousands of years that we have been living in a different manner. So you should stick more or less to what you're doing in terms of timing of meals throughout the year.
So, the fasting mimicking diet is a growing and popular approach for those that don't want to actually do a fast. And there's pros and cons. There's, I'm sure, distinct advantages, such as not being hungry all the time. But will you break down what the fasting mimicking diet is and how it works?
Yeah, and maybe kind of arrest you a bit as well. It's not just for people who can't handle a water fast. It could actually be for people who want to have better effects of their fast, because I guess, and it's a very natural thought, and we're accustomed to thinking like you, especially if you're a man, perhaps, that I don't know, that you you have to go all in, you have to be hardcore, you shouldn't eat anything during your fast. But who knows? Maybe, actually eating something, getting some support during your fast can be good and even better. And also, when you eat during your fast, you can also extend your fast for longer, and that could also be, because you're not maybe losing that much muscle mass, and you can do a more fast more often. So on the fasting mimicking diet, you eat 4 meals a day. You can eat less, but and it's more than just it's not just a little bit more than nothing. It's actually maybe one third of what you eat per day. So the fasting mimicking diet was an idea, was crafted by Walter Longo, a researcher from the United States, or he's originally Italian. He had done the kind of basic research on the lack of nutrients in yeast cells, and then he's worked his way all the way up to humans. And he wanted to see what happens when cancer patients do fasting, water fasting. But he couldn't get them to do it. And then okay, how about if you eat something during the fast? And that was much more. The cancer patient were much more welcoming to that idea. So, and he's done, several clinical studies on it, and also other groups. Um, and also one study that compared in animals to water fast, the fasting mimicking diet, which showed that there were better effects on inflammatory bowel disease when you actually ate something, when you did the fasting mimicking diet, as compared to water fast. So, but in humans, there are no comparative studies, and for me, I've been doing courses on this. I've written a book on this, and I get a lot of feedback. How does it feel to do this way of fasting compared to water fasting? And for many, it's they wouldn't do a water fast. This is a way to get going, to actually try a fast, and also the relation to food. Because when you eat something 4 meals a day, when you're hungry, the food tastes, delicious. It's everything tastes good then. So maybe some people are kind of tired or fed up with food, and they're not that interested. But boy, will they be interested when they when they the food is taken away from them, and they can only eat as, just not that much.
But when you're actually working a fasting mimicking diet into your routine, you're not just consuming fewer calories. Are you avoiding any certain foods, or are you avoiding stimulating certain pathways such as insulin or mTOR via like heavy protein consumption? How are you actually implementing it?
It's a vegan diet, so I mean, nothing wrong with meat, but just for these 5 days, that's the usual time frame that you're doing it. And maybe you're doing one time a year or 10 times, and so yeah, what you're mentioning is that we don't want to affect the mTOR too much. So it's low in protein. It's just 16 grams of protein from days 2 through to 5. Yeah, and there's also a few supplements. So cysteine, the amino acid cysteine, is really very special in terms of fasting and autophagy. So, usually amino acids, at least some of the amino acids, they will affect mTOR and tell the body now the fast is over. And, so if you eat too much protein, that can lead to lesser effects. But cysteine is the body's own way of letting it know that the amino acids that we are seeing now within the cell, it's actually coming from your own cell or from your own body. So the cysteine is released from these as internal compartments where proteins are broken down, and then there's a selective release of cysteine from these compartments, and then which tells the body that, okay, oh, wait a minute, the fast is not over. These amino acids, I mean, use them, build new stuff, but continue with the autophagy and the fasting state. So if you add cysteine from outside, just in a capsule, just that amino acid, that's at least the idea. There's no hard data on it, but that can enhance the fast, make it easier to fast, perhaps, and you get better effects. And then it's also glycerol is part of the fasting mimicking diet as well. There's even less hard data on that. We know from uh, from um, from microorganisms that if they are fed glycerol as compared to sugar, they will live much longer. So it could also be something that is enhancing the fast. And when you fast or when you use a lot of your own body fat, you will have a release of triglycerides, but also the backbone of the triglycerides, which is glycerol. So it's yet another way to tell the body that there's a fast going on here.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about the biomimicry components of things you can use to amplify the effects of the fasting mimicking diet. Before we go into that, help me understand more about the structure of the diet itself, because you'll hear the certain people in the fasting community say, "Oh, is it like does this break the fast?" And they'll list just about everything under the sun. And I'd assume that the main mechanisms that people think about this through are the one through calories, two through like protein or insulin action via like, simple carbohydrates. So with the fasting mimicking diet, you're going to be breaking some components of the fast. Like I'm not sure if you get the same level of autophagy, like cellular cleanup activation from FMD versus a normal dry fast or water fast. What are you seeing in terms of like how this compares and contrasts?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I have to go back to the study that I mentioned earlier that actually saw a better effect on autoimmunity when you were eating something during the fast. So it's not a correct way of seeing it. Let's say you eat just one blueberry one day. You know, does that actually change something for the body? Is that a completely different situation than for the body? It's like, no, it's the same. It's like, I don't have proteins. I don't have any energy. It's like, so how about 100 blueberries? Where does it stop? And you can measure, let's say you eat 10 blueberries or you eat what's on the fasting, how much of an insulin increase will you see? And also it depends on what you eat as well. So when you're in an energy deficit and you're eating while you're in an energy deficit, and the foods that comes in, it's not really that much. It's like it's still an energy deficit. You're constantly in energy deficit during the entire fast. Maybe one meal is a bit larger than the other, and it might be a few minutes where you're actually getting some energy stored. But I should also acknowledge what you're saying, that we don't really know that well. So we haven't done, or these studies that have compared this they haven't been done. So it's still possible to make the argument that, yeah, no, I don't quite believe you. I think that to be sure, I don't want to eat any carbohydrates, and I want to eat less than what is on the fasting mimicking diet. So, and also if you notice that you are hungry, there's definitely something happening. And that's interesting, which one has seen that actually hunger in itself is a part of the fasting effects on the body.
But I know that from when I've perused the forums, I've gotten questions like, okay, is 10 calories breaking the fast? Is 50 calories breaking the fast? You hear all these different numbers thrown out. And if you think about it, if you're actually moving around at all throughout the day, you're going up a couple flights of stairs, you're going to be burning those 10 calories anyway. And your blood glucose naturally fluctuates throughout the day. And your body's going to use glucagon and, if it needs to, cortisol to regulate that anyway. So you're not going to have completely stable insulin to begin with.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Oh, the other thing there is that there might be like cellular, like mechanistic theories of what's going on inside the body if you're doing a pure fast, a strict fast versus FMD. But really, what matters more are the clinical outcomes, the changes people see. And if people are seeing better effects in any domains from FMD versus strict fasting, and it's also much easier to adhere to than it is to do a 3-day or 5-day water fast. So that like alone has some extra weight to it, or it should at least.
Yeah, exactly. And what's the best way of doing a fast for you? Well, that's the fast that you actually can complete. So if you're not doing the fast, well, maybe if you eat 1.5 times what's on the FMD, maybe that's actually pretty good.
Let's talk about how it actually looks. In your book, you have multiple different colors of menus, the blue menu, yellow menu, purple menu, green menu, orange menu. Can you break down what these are and why you decided to structure it like this?
Well, the main idea is to have something to choose from. So if you every time you're doing the fast, you just have one menu. So you can, I guess, you can get a bit fed up with that. But there are also different ways of planning and prepping the meals. So the purple menu, you only have to make 2 meals a day, and then you can split the 2 meals into two. So if you want to, and then you have the green menu, which is you can eat on the go, so to say. It's you don't have to have a kitchen. You just have to weigh the nuts and the carrots and whatever uh, at the start of the day, and then you can just put it in your backpack or purse or whatever, and then you can eat it whenever you want.
How compatible is this for folks with, say, some level of gut dysbiosis? For example, carnivore has become really popular because people are developing food sensitivities and perhaps high levels of lipopolysaccharides or endotoxin. And when they completely cut out all plant foods and they just have meat in the short term as like an elimination diet, it works wonders for them and they feel a lot better. And because this is a vegan diet, and I'm assuming that it has a very high level of carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates and all that that can be gut irritants if you have like gut dysbiosis or a leaky gut or you have an imbalanced gut microbiome. Do you recommend that they do anything differently, or is this compatible for them as well?
Well, first off, I'm pretty sure that there are some people who will not that the diet will not sit well with them. But my impression, though, is that people who react to FODMAPs, for instance, that they tolerate the FODMAPs on the fasting mimicking diet. Maybe because actually their body is working better right off the bat when they start the diet, but also because it isn't that much food. So in any case, it's not that much carbohydrates. It's just it's a bit more than what you would eat in a ketogenic diet. So it's not that much carbs. A lot of people want to do adaptations and they want to cut out things, but I don't think that it's really that necessary. People have found like, oh yeah, carnivore is so for me, and like I can't tolerate. But I try to push them a bit to, you know, I think your diet is a bit too strict. You've been on a carnivore diet for half a year now. Maybe the fasting mimicking diet could be one way of a soft way of getting a bit out of the carnivore diet, which I think that sure, if you know what you're doing, you can thrive on that for a very long time. But for the average person and to be on the safe side, I would add some plant foods.
And oftentimes, the diet that gets you healthy is not the same diet that's going to keep you that way.
That's a very, very good point.
Give us a feel of some of the superfoods that are most commonly repeated on the diet, just so we can get an understanding of what this would look like. You mentioned carrots earlier. Are those a staple?
It's important. Maybe it's that not that clear to the listeners. So it's not a diet like that you follow all through the year. It's these 5 days. So it's a way of doing the fast, and it's called it a diet because we eat something. So the main thing are the things that we have mentioned: the supplements, the amount of protein. But between the fasts, and this is what I'm writing a book on now, is how then you can add some foods and foodstuffs, supplements that have fasting mimicking properties. So some of these kind of call them superfoods, if you like, or have these properties are parsley, ginger, vanilla, green tea, and lots of the berries. They contain the substances that are affecting the NAD cycle that some may be familiar with. So, and that's also an important thing when it comes to fasting mimicking substances or you can call them calorie restriction substances, that I think there's evidence to show that it's better if you think about how does the body actually work? How does the cell operate? And if you just take NMN, for instance, to increase your NAD levels, then you're missing at least half of the picture, I think, because NMN is turned into NAD, but then it's broken down again, and you can recycle that. And to do that, you can affect the enzymes that are influenced or are part of the cycle. And that's where parsley, for instance, in green tea comes in. So then you can use less NMN or a nice niacinamide and get more bang for the buck.
There's a lot of cool fasting mimetics out there. I interviewed a company called Mimio Health, Dr. Chris Rhodes, and he was talking about their product where they tested the autophagy response at different time periods, and they tried to make a formula that mimicked the biological effects of I think it's 36-hour fast. And one of the ones they used was spermidine. They didn't use this one, but in my own research, berberine seems pretty popular as a fasting mimetic and potentially amplifier. There's also, I want to say, ergothioneine and L-beta. There's a bunch of different substances you can add in. Are there any others that you're familiar with or a fan of aside from what you mentioned earlier, which was cysteine and glycerol?
Yeah, so I don't personally use cysteine or glycerol except for when I'm doing the fast. Maybe a few at night sometimes if I think of it. Or you have pterosilbane. I don't know how you pronounce that in English. And also the controversial resveratrol. And then some people will say that what you're taking resveratrol, that's been debunked, or science has showed that it doesn't work. But then you also know that it's part of the NAD cycle, that it can affect some enzymes there, so it can still work if in conjunction with other things. I'm more onto the food part, that actually you don't take supplements, but like, so where do you get ergothioneine from? But all these different things, you find them in food, and some of these substances, it's just too little. You just have to, if you find fisetin in strawberries, and if you eat like half a kilo, sure, it's going to be something. But then eat half a kilo every day. Yeah. So then it seems like you have to have a bit more than just 20 strawberries per day to get some proper effects.
So for the ginger and the vanilla and maybe turmeric, are you cooking with these or are these just like things that you'll take separately as like food supplement kind of thing?
Both. So vanilla, it tastes good, so I can add something to the food when that, or to some drinks. So I have this this drink that I can have some cocoa and turmeric and not that much, because that doesn't taste that good, but and vanilla, and maybe some coffee, decaf coffee, and maybe some glycerol to add some sweet taste to it. Yeah. So, but then also take just powder, mix a lot of different supplements and have a powder, and I take some scoops.
What kind of powder?
16, 17 different these things that we have been talking about. Pterosilbane, and NMN and vanilla and ginger powder, and also you call it collagen, and lots of things that I can't even remember now. But I just want to add as well that the timing of these supplements appears to be important as well. When it's seen in a study, that was the injection, they injected NAD or something that was quickly converted to NAD in mice. And when they gave them that at the wrong time of day, just before they went to bed, so to speak, they did not have the good effects on their physiology as opposed to when they did it in the morning. And also, there's a study done by Nushido, by Nicola Conlon, on NAD, and they also gave the supplements that were supposed to, with a lot of these things that I'm mentioning now, green tea and such, they gave that for breakfast and for lunch, and not later. And I think that there was an idea behind that. They didn't mention that in the text. Why did they not take it at evening time? But I think that they're up to date with the science in that regard.
That's what I was saying earlier, that the timing of not only our meals, but also the supplements we take is really important. For example, vitamin D is one that I would never take at night, simply because if you look at like through an ancestral lens, humans would not be getting vitamin D exposure at 9 p.m. That would be more of a morning or afternoon or late afternoon kind of thing.
And it's like, if you're a doctor or if you're doing research, and it's pretty granular, so it's like, so who is taking care of the big picture here? So that's interesting when I'm talking to people like you, like, so you try to see a lot of things at the same time, and that's why you have such an important function, I think.
One thing that I see as a parallel and common throughout a lot of the substances you've mentioned so far is that they come from foods, obviously, and then also that they tend to be foods that are really rich and high in polyphenols. Is that a coincidence, or is there a strong role of polyphenols in the fasting mimicking diet?
No, again, so it's more about the calories and the lack of proteins during these 5 days. It could be that if you add a lot of polyphenols during the diet, you will get even more effect. So it has been that we have thought about it, but it's not like a major important thing as far as we can see now. So, but we've tried to include, as healthy foods as possible in the diet. And polyphenols, there in general, one can say that they are. It's really hard to say the evolutionary role and why the effects appear to be what they are, but it appears to tell the body that there is something going on here. You have to get stronger when you eat all these polyphenols for some reason. So it's a way of communicating with nature around you and the state of the nature. Maybe the hunt didn't go as well, so you have to eat more plant foods, and then the body is like preparing for tough times.
That's exactly what Joel Green wrote about in his recent book called The Way. How we had the two modes, we had the feasting and the foraging, and like when food was scarce, then we would not have the ample mTOR activation. We wouldn't have as much protein. We wouldn't have the large game. We would instead be relegated to the foraging foods like the berries, the tubers, the stuff that we could pick. And the combination of those, like that sets the body up. It sets up the microbiome for greater butyrate production and short chain fatty acid production, which has a protective effect on the rest of the body and helps offset against some of the consequences that happen when you consume a ton of meat all at once. And it helps reduce the risks of like the fermentation and ammonia byproducts and certain like TMAO and other things that are looked down upon in terms of reasons that meat is widely considered unhealthy. And I was curious, since you have studied and written and published papers on the microbiome, what is the role here with the fasting mimicking diet? Because I was thinking that polyphenols might have a good effect, a synergistic effect with this diet. That's why.
When it comes to the microbiome, I sure doing a fast can affect the microbiome, but when it comes to or what I have previously written about and in a paper which is called something like the Western diet and metabolic disease, it was more about the everyday diet that you have, and their polyphenols definitely play a role. If you eat, let's say, you eat energy-dense foods and a lot of starches and other things that disrupt your microbiome, and then in addition, you don't have polyphenols there, then that might lead to these more harmful microbes that they're not kept in check. So that could be if you eat a lot of very processed foods or you have had a meal that was not good at all, and then you remember that you have some berries in your freezer. Maybe you should add that as a dessert, and that could actually maybe repair some of the ill effects of that meal. So that's one way of looking at it. So these. Why do plants produce polyphenols? Well, it's partly because they want to protect themselves against these microorganisms. So it's not a stretch to think that that might also do the same job in our intestines.
Have you done any research into how the fasting mimicking diet impacts the microbiomes, whether it's the gut or it's somewhere else in the body?
I so would have hoped that there would have been more research on that, and it's like there's a dearth of info on that when it comes to how fasting affects the microbiome. If you eat a very non-varied diet, it's just you eat the same all the time, then some microbes that will be getting a lot of food and they can outnumber the other ones. So if you don't eat that much at all, there's scarcity, which is actually could be good for the microbiome. Then it's there's nobody who can really get the upper hand that easily. Maybe the only ones who can get a bit more upper hand are those bacteria that like to eat slime, that like to eat what we produce, like Akkermansia. But that's known as a as a beneficial species. So
Yeah, I was going to ask about that exact thing actually. Akkermansia and other like bacteria and species that exist in the gut. I know that fasting can obviously result in very low carbohydrate intake, which combined with low polyphenol intake as often is done in strict fasting. People who do it often sometimes have less diversity in their guts. Have you seen any beneficial or negative changes? I'm curious how that would compare with fasting mimicking diet, if you'd have like the same die off, potential die off, or if because you're still including some of these foods, it'd be less of an issue.
again, there's no hard data really, but it could be that if you're doing a water fast, and for for a week, maybe that's just too much for even for the microbes that they're the beneficial microbes, if you can call it that, there's maybe suffering a bit too much. And let's say you're unlucky and then you get some kind of foodborne infection right after you're done with a fast, and then your beneficial microbes are not in shape. Maybe you're going to be more at risk of ill effects.
Who should be considering this? Is this going to be a good tool for someone in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s? Where would you start considering implementing this into lifestyle?
So what I wrote in my book is that there's probably not that much of a reason to fast for someone who's younger than 20 years old. At the same time, or because you're developing, and of course you can tolerate a few days of not eating. I mean, sure, I definitely, but and also aging. When we're talking about fasting, there's a lot of talk about aging as well. It affects the aging mechanisms. So yeah, why not start pretty early if you feel great, you're 25 years old and you do a fasting mimicking diet 2 times a year. I mean, sure, why not? And but if you feel like, oh, this is something you should do, and you have maybe you're not that a healthy relationship with your body, and then you're adding fasting on top of it, and maybe it leads to you not having that good a relationship with food. I mean, so
Okay. So my paradigm, the way I see it, is that the younger you are, the less frequently you want to consider something like this because your body's in a growth mode. And the older you get, the more often makes sense because you've accumulated more, like build up more cellular waste, debris that needs to be recycled and flushed out. At the same time, I see it as a seesaw. Like the more you're doing this, the more attention and focus you need to put on actually rebuilding afterward because you break the body back down and you help it recycle. But if you're not actually feeding properly in the time between, then you're going to be just increasing your risks of sarcopenia and other degenerative conditions without that proper attention afterward.
yeah, that's a good point. But there are some caveats there, and if you don't fast that long, let's say if you fast for 10 days, it's a water fast. Sure, it will affect your muscle mass, or it doesn't have to be bad in the long term. But if you're doing that like several times, sometimes a year, the risk will increase. Now, if you eat something during your fast, if you're doing a fasting mimicking diet and for 5 days, then the body's pretty good at taking the proteins that are not that useful, that are a bit damaged, using that first before they use the actual functional protein structures. So that's one thing. And but also if you use the fasting mimicking diet as a way of losing weight, then you kind of maybe you're on a kind of a low calorie diet before the fast, and then you continue with the low calorie diet after the fast. That's not the way of doing it. So definitely eat like until you're full before the fast. Then when you're done with the fast, you are done with the fast, and then it's really important to then replenish. Definitely, but also when it comes to when you're young, it's also if you can actually delay aging when you're 25, then you will not get to a point where you have accumulated so much, because if you're 50 and you've accumulated a lot of damage, you can't reverse it that easily. So I think that's also an argument to also start early, that you don't have that much to repair, so that therefore it is easier to repair it as well.
Oh, I agree. And I think if you have less to repair because you're younger, there is less rationale to do it 10 times a year. You might as well just do it less frequently because there's not as much to repair. And you also want to make sure you're getting the best of the growth pathways as well.
Yeah.
What about other things that people sometimes use with fasting, such as like proteolytic systemic enzymes to like help break down fibrinogen and scar tissue? And I'm not sure if enzymes are often used alongside this or essential amino acids. Obviously, that's going to negate a lot of the mTOR side, mTOR benefits of fasting. But for people who have concerns about like loss of muscle mass, to say they're in their 80s, 85, 90, and they can't necessarily afford to go a week without much protein, much anabolism. Is that a approach you've seen taken?
I have not, I haven't seen a single paper on it, and it's not been on my radar. So that's something I have to read up on actually. I really don't, I couldn't say. And but when it comes to older people, the fasts, some older people, if they are frail, maybe they shouldn't fast at all. Maybe, long night fast. But if they want to do the fasting mimicking diet, maybe they should add a bit more protein. Maybe they should not fast for as long as usual. And so that's also a point to yeah, make note of.
Okay. Why 5 days specifically?
So I met Walter Longo at a conference 3 years ago, or yeah, something like that. So I was really interested in this question: why 5 days? Why 750 calories, kilocalories per day, days 2 to 5? And there's not really a clear answer to that, or the answer is that you had to choose something, or he had to choose something. And if you have to do 7 days, that could be a bit too. Let's say if you maybe start on a Sunday, and then by Friday you'll be done and you can have a proper weekend kind of and eat with friends and whatever. So but if you only do 3 days, then you might not see enough effects. And actually, there was this Norwegian, or some other people as well, study that came out this winter, which actually gave some much needed data on what happens during the different days of the fast. And it was really, they looked at the proteome. So they looked at what kind of substances does the body produce on the different days of the fast. And because you've been known from before that insulin will go down and you will start producing more ketones, etc. We've known that for a long time, but that doesn't really say much about how does the fast actually affect inflammation and things that have to do with rheumatoid arthritis, and things that you want to use the fast for. And what they saw was that they measured 3,000 important proteins, or that some of the most important ones. And they saw that 1/3 of them, 1,000 of them, changed when you were fasting. But this didn't occur, it wasn't statistically significant until day 3. And some of these substances, they went up and then they went down again, and some had a slow increase all the time. So I think it makes sense then that you fast for at least 3 days, and then you swim in the good state you're in for at least a few days more, so that you can be a bit more sure that you will reap the benefits. And if you want to do it even more prolonged, then sure, you can do 6 or 7 days. It's more easier to actually start a fast if it's not 10 days, or it's 5 days and you're actually eating something during the fast as well.
Is it advantageous to have more, say, 5 day periods versus a couple longer 7 or 8 day periods?
We just don't know. There's no data. So it depends, like, how do you live? Have you had a horrendous month that you didn't really plan for, and then you really want to clean up? Okay, so maybe you should do a longer fast than if you just had a fast just a month ago and have been living pretty well since then.
I also wonder about the opposite of that. If you've had a horrendous month, that if you then stress your body further by going into a low energy state where there's less nutrient availability, less calories available, if you're going to downregulate your thyroid, for example, and then increase levels of your stress hormones, and probably or possibly do worse than if you had a great month and then you said, okay, now I'm going to do the fasting mimicking diet instead.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, let's say that you had a horrible month in terms of, alcohol and a bad diet, but you feel, okay, you're not that stressed, and you just, hey, I don't want any more food now. It's like I just want to be clean, and I'm at a good place mentally, and then I don't think that's a bad thing to do a fast in that state. I think that's exactly what you need.
Practically speaking, what can you consume? Because that's going to question that's going to come up. Obviously, water is fine, but drinks like coffee and tea and the other restrictions on what sweeteners people use and get good benefit from this diet?
So I just tend to say that it could be a detox from a lot of things. Like, what are your cravings? What's driving? Why do you like to eat late at night? Why do you like sweet stuff? And just do it clean. And but sure, you can have some tea, some coffee, but sweeteners. I'm not saying that that's going to be detrimental to your health if you use a bit of sweeteners during your fast, but still, why do you need it? And maybe you should do it as cleanly as possible to get to know your body in a different manner. And also, caffeine can lead to increased autophagy. And you can also increase stress because when you're fasting, you can have, more stress. And if you use a lot of caffeine, it can be negating those effects again. But if you have, a low level of caffeine, it might be not be too. And there are other substances in coffee, trigonelin, that could be good as well. So definitely, if you drink coffee usually, then maybe stick to 1 or 2 cups per day instead of 5 if you do that usually.
Yeah, I noticed when I was doing the water/coffee fasts, sometimes on day 2 or 3, I would just increase my coffee consumption a bit. And I thought to myself, wow, I feel great. And then I realized later that it was sure I was feeling good, but it was also from one increased levels of or increased consumption of caffeine, which then also let me ride a much longer cortisol, norepinephrine, noradrenaline buzz that kept me going, feeling wired and energetic, but probably the consequence of my health. It was probably too much.
Yeah, did you crash afterwards?
A little bit, but I mean, it's hard to know how much of it was actually crashing and how much was just like the waves that come and go from the fast. But I mean, I recognized afterward that I didn't need that level of caffeine and that level of energy. Having not eaten was definitely induced and increased by the caffeine, the coffee.
Yeah, and it's a very good point. The body will work in a different manner, and although you're used to different things in your everyday life, you should be a bit aware, and also maybe if you feel well and you're doing you go for a run on the third day of your fast and you feel great, and then but maybe boom, you'll hit the wall, and if you're in Norway, maybe it might be cold outside and you're like, an hour from home. So, don't do a long, hard, cross country skiing exercise on day 3 of your fast. That could be not good at all.
Especially if you're unfamiliar with your body going through these periods of fasting to begin with. Maybe after you've done it 5 or 6 times, you know where that limit is, where that wall is that you can edge up against, and preferably not push too hard against, because that way you stay safe. But the more experience should help.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, let's say if you're on a ketogenic diet before, or maybe last week before you enter into a fast, you will tolerate, long distance exercises much better on say day 3 of the fast.
Then when it comes to supplements with intermittent fasting, with fasting, with keto, electrolytes are very common additions, and they can be very helpful, especially when water fasting, because we deplete a lot of sodium, which sodium's electrolyte sparing. So then we excrete out a bunch of the other electrolytes. What's your take on maintaining supplement regimens while following FMD?
So you can stick with most of the things that you're taking in your everyday life. So, but then there are supplements that contain proteins, energy, like omega-3 supplements and protein powders. Of course, you shouldn't use them. Or omega-3s, sure, if you substitute some of the fats that are on the fasting mimicking diet with omega-3s, that's fine. Um, Now, when it comes to electrolytes, we should also remember that the body's pretty good at adjusting. So you don't get much salt in, but it still can go pretty well. And even though you're losing more sodium, it's not, it could also be, and I don't have, a lot of data on that, but it could also be an adaptation that is kind of partly wanted as well. Um, so I'm not that heavy on advising people to use a lot of salt, but I do say salt your food.
Yeah, and I guess if you're already consuming food, I guess it's more of an issue when you're just dry fasting or water fasting and you don't have those additions of salt and natural electrolytes in your diet.
Yeah.
What's the general like macro breakdown of like the percentage wise? Because I know that when I do this, I want to put it all into an app to track what it is that I'm consuming for a couple of days as I get the hang of it. I'll probably use one like chronometer, but there's a lot of options out there. And that way, after I get the feel for what it looks and feels like, then I don't need to track it anymore and I'll just have an idea.
So I can't actually remember the exact macronutrient in percentages breakdown of that, but maybe you can do a quick math with me here. But so it's 16 grams of protein days 2 to 5.
I guess it's because is it in expressed in raw number of grams because everyone follows the same like caloric needs, or does the caloric?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same for everyone, except the glycerol is different. That's based on weight, and it might seem, a bit strange. So let's say you're 120 kilos, or you're 50 kilos. Should they eat the same? But I think that we should think of it in terms of uh, the a 75 kilo person. I don't know what that is in pounds, but so that's kind of what it's made for, so to say. Then you can, if you're weighing a little less, then okay, maybe you could eat a bit less. But at the same time, let's say you weigh 120 kilos and a lot of that is fat. It's additional, maybe 40 kilos of fat. Then you're still not going to need that much more because you have so much more fat to take from. So that's kind of, but if you're 45 kilos, yeah, okay, skip one of the meals then. That's how you can think about it. So, the rest after the proteins and the carbohydrates, the rest is fat.
How many grams of carbohydrate of carbs?
About 56.
You said how many calories total?
So it is, if you count with the glycerol or without, but it's about, without the glycerol, it's about 713 calories,
So is
I think.
glycerol a required part of?
I speak, or I mention it often, that like, do go buy a glycerol. It tastes sweet. You can mix it in your drink, and it's more likely to have some good benefits than not. And it's good to just have it if you have a rough day and you feel extra hungry, and then you have that in your cupboard. And
Speaking of sweet things that can help, have you looked into one of the non-essential amino acids called glycine? It makes up about 30% of collagen, and it's sweet also. And I see some benefits, potential benefits in terms of like helping with fasts.
when it comes to fast, I haven't looked into it. I don't recommend that, but there might be good reasons for that. I do take glycine, extra glycine every day myself as part of my slowing of aging supplement stack. So, yeah.
And then what's the role of meal timing in this? Does it matter when you're eating?
So I'm a big fan of time restricted eating and not eating too late, as we talked about. But during the fasting mimicking diet, it's not really an issue because you're fasting all the time still. The meals are so small and people who maybe have a hard time falling asleep if they're hungry, I advise them to, maybe you should eat right before you go to bed, just to fill up your stomach, but it's still fasting.
Do people adjust to the hunger sensation before they go to sleep?
Yeah, as for me, how can I go to bed and be hungry? I'm not gonna fall asleep. But it's really strange, and it's like, okay, you're hungry, and I go to bed and like I lie there for 15 minutes, and then boom, it's the next morning. So it's much less of a problem than people anticipate, definitely.
Yeah, I'm pretty active. I burn on average like around 4,000 calories per day. I'm moving a lot. I'm training a lot. Would I want to change my ratios or total calories or tone back the training for the 5 day period?
I'm actually an advisor to an athlete. He's one of the best, or maybe top 30 in the world in the sport of orienteering. So he's done a few fasts, and I've given him the permission, so to say, to eat at least before some competitions. He doesn't do like the most important competitions when he's fasting, but he can have a banana extra before he's doing his interval trainings, for instance.
Is there a reason you chose bananas? I mean, like, is it a good macro breakdown, or is it because it's low in protein or something totally different?
Low in protein, and when you're doing some exercise, what you would, if you want to get some benefit from that food, it's like then you're a bit low on carbohydrates, and then you can get some carbohydrates from that. It can rescue you, so to say. But at the same time, the body is gets so well adapted to the fasting state, so it's not really that even during a training, it's not like low blood sugar is going to be that much of a problem either. But maybe if you're not adapted before the fast, and especially day 2, 3, maybe 4, that's what I would have in my pocket, some carbohydrates.
Okay. Is it a reasonable heuristic that when in doubt, choosing between two foods, the one that's higher in carbohydrates, lower in protein is going to be a better choice while on this protocol, or is it too hard to say?
It appears that when you lower the calories during a fast, the macronutrient ratio doesn't appear to be that important. It's still important, it seems, but it's not that important. So you can do a protein fast. You can eat as much food as you want, as long as it's low in protein, and you will be on a protein fast, which will give you effects. We've seen this in animals that if they feed them with and they lack completely, one amino acid, they will get some health benefits.
So what I think I understood is that it's better to restrict total number of calories. That's the first and foremost. And then after that, the lower protein choice is likely going to be better. But then again, it depends on how much lower, like how different. But like two foods are very similar, just with different levels of different ratios of carbohydrates and proteins. The carbohydrate one is going to be a better choice.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to talk about this because in a book, I can't do you can do this and you can do that, and like this is the fasting mimicking diet period. But there definitely are, if this is what gets you through the fasting period, then good. You can make some adaptations, and you will definitely get some benefits still, even though you eat 2 bananas extra during your 5 days of fasting.
Speaking of, we're winding down now. And I should ask you this much earlier, but what are some of the things that people report improving or seeing differences in from using the fasting mimicking diet?
So this is the physical thing, or maybe the psychological thing first, because people that have started on this diet, and I did courses before where I met them just after they had completed their fast, and they were just so serene, and they were kind of king of the mountain, um, because they had completed their fast, and also maybe some of the mental effects that the fast actually has. Well, we know that it can affect the morphine receptors in the brain, so you just feel good. Um, and they didn't really care that much about the symptoms. But then when I asked them, like, so what about your bodily symptoms? Oh yeah, yeah, that's improved as well. But they were just so happy. So, but what I see the most, I would say, is pain. So people who have pain every day, they see that will be heavily reduced, and like pretty early in their fast, and then slowly the pain can come back after the fast, and then they do new fast, and for some people the pain doesn't come back, then it's just gone.
Since there, as far as I'm aware, aren't long-term human clinical trials showing how this affects people in 30, 40 years down the line of performing it regularly, we're also theorizing here that this will improve longevity and health span and quality of life.
Yeah. So I think that we can use these animal studies that have been done. It's not like we aren't totally different, and there's some pretty clear effects there. So, and we do know that these aging mechanisms that they are affected in humans as well. You also, if you're doing fasting and you don't have any problems with that, and maybe you have a reduction in pain, I mean, why wouldn't you do it? And then there's the added possible benefit of you actually having more healthy years.
Along that line, have you heard of people combining other longevity therapeutics with this, such as, say, senolytics?
Not really combining it. And would it be good to do it during the fast or straight after, or I really can't say. But that's something that I might test, and then maybe add some quercetin or fisetin, or but I do take that from before, or already. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to continue with that during a fast as well.
We'll start to wind this one down. And if people want to connect with you, to follow your work, to find you on PubMed, how do they go about that?
Yeah, they can search for my name on PubMed, as you're saying, Lindseth, Lindseth. And then I can also do international calls if people want to get my advice. So they can find me on houseofhealth.no. That's the clinic where I work, and we're venturing more and more into the longevity space. And a lot of my stuff is in Norwegian. I'm sorry for that. So, but I hope to, have more stuff out in English.
Yep. And I'll put a link to all of those in the show notes, as well as your book. And hopefully we can convince publishers to create an English version of it, although I have the English Spark notes. So thank you for that. A couple more questions before we call it a day. If there was a worldwide burning of the books and all knowledge is lost, but you get to save the works of 3 teachers, who would you choose and why?
Some philosopher, like one of the last ones I've read a bit from is Marcus Aurelius.
How about in the nutritional world? Anything in the health or wellness or nutrition space that you have found to be a really great resource?
Well, right now I'm reading the book by Chris Fentelican. It was written about ultra-processed foods. And even though I knew a lot about this from before, the way he is written about this topic is just really good. So it just, puts a lot of the pieces together very, very clearly. So that's my first thought.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother specialty of yours that we didn't even get to dive into today, perhaps at a later date. But actually, before we wrap this one up, what is one thing that your tribe does not know about you?
Quite often, actually, it's that I eat breakfast. Maybe they think that, you must skip breakfast. But then again, it's not that much. But it could be a hearty breakfast at times. So.
There you go. You tied a bow on it. We started off by talking about the meal timing and breaking the routine, and you ended sharing how you break your own routine sometimes. Okay. How would you like to wrap this one up? And if people have made it this far in the conversation, are there any parting thoughts or ideas you want to leave them with?
If you eat at the wrong time, if you eat really late, I think that is a thing that is maybe more detrimental than at least I thought a few years ago. It appears to be pretty important to not eat a large meal very late.
Are there any stats or numbers or things that stood out to you when you were looking at this that shaped or changed your opinion?
It was this one study by some Spanish name 2 years ago. Still, it's in mice, but still, where mice got 1 meal a day at the wrong time, or the right time, so to say, in the morning, and it was in a caloric deficient setting, but still the mice they lived 13% longer when they ate at the right time. So I think that's pretty staggering.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been fun chatting about your background, your experience, and the fasting mimicking diet, the immune system, and a whole lot more.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on your podcast.
I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.